So hello again, and welcome to Seminar 2, Session 2 of our review of the Book of Ruth from a sort of Christological sense, or as we touched on last time, a Christotelic, because as we're going to see, the Book of Ruth really drives us towards the period of Jesus and the things that he's achieved for us. And so today, as we get on to chapter 2, we're going to start to see the love story aspect really emerge. Last week, as we started in chapter 1, we focused very much on the setup. And as part of the setup, we saw there was kind of the structured way in which all of the key components were put in place. There was a famine in the land, so it was unusual circumstances that pushed this family, Elimelech and Naomi, up to Moab. So they had to kind of probably come down through the south of the country and into Moab, where there was a little bit more rainfall because of a slightly higher elevation. So there they're finding some bread. But when they're there, Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi, but at least she has two marriageable sons who take two Moabite wives. But in that context, they both die too. Their names were sickly and failing, so perhaps they were never that healthy. And Naomi is left in this tragic situation. She's a strange lady in a strange land with no relatives, nobody that knows her well, no real hope. But in that context, she seems to have obviously made quite an impact on the two women that have married her sons. Because when she sets out to return to Jerusalem, because she's heard that now there's bread in Bethlehem and at least there'll be some distant relatives there, as she sets out, they kind of want to come with her, but on the way she keeps on arguing with them against it doesn't make sense. She says, even if I got back, even if I had a child tonight and gave birth to him, you're not going to wait for him to grow up. And so in that context, one of them, Orpah, decides to go back to her family, but Ruth says no, and by faith she pushes herself into God's plans through his people, and she says, your God will be my God, and where you go I'll go, and where you die I'll die. And by this incredible moment of faith, she kind of wrests herself into something that should have been impossible to break into, that by the law, by the letter of the law, as we saw in Deuteronomy, Moabites were excluded for at least 10 generations, and as we saw as well, this story happens in the time of the judges, just 3 or 4 generations into the promised land. So she does something that by in the natural sense, by the letter of the law, was unaccomplishable, but by faith and her commitment she somehow gets hold and she becomes part of the story. And as we know, she becomes a forebearer of Jesus through David, who is of course that great hero from that period. So those were some of the aspects that we were kind of picking up and looking at. And as we got to the end of chapter 1 last time, we'd just seen Naomi and Ruth arriving in Bethlehem, and if you remember, Naomi had expressed that she would like to be known as Mary. Don't call her Naomi, which means pleasant or delightful, that kind of idea. She's saying, no, instead I want to be Mara, because I'm bitter and I have no hope. And she was in a very kind of hopeless place. And as we move on to chapter 2, we start to see hope returning, and we start to see the love interest playing out. But before we go there, I just want to take a step back, if you like, from getting too much into the romance. And it is a real romance, which we're going to start seeing. It becomes very Jane Austen during this chapter, because actually the story itself has a kind of greater excitement when we see it within its political context. So last week I mentioned that the language used in the Book of Ruth so has a number of early markers, which mean the story somehow goes back to some period in the pre-exile. Doesn't seem to go back in terms of the language being used right the way to the time of Judges, but at some point it was written down as a story in the pre-exile period, but probably of the divided kingdom. It uses what's referred to as standard biblical Hebrew, so it has some of those grammatic markers in it. So it looks like the story came about, or got written down, let's say. It probably could have been orally told, it's part of David's story, but it got written down and perhaps circulated a little bit in the pre-exilic period. But the book as we have it now also has a fair number of later markers, which clearly put it in the post-exile, the return from exile. And that it's not surprising that, so the book as it finally comes to us comes from the post-exile, after the return from exile. And in that context, it actually has quite a dynamic flavour to it. And because, as we're going to see, this whole issue of intermarriage has suddenly become a big, hot political issue. So if we first of all go to the book of Ezra, And actually, in the book of Ezra, right towards the end, Ezra, the book of Ezra starts before Ezra. It starts with Zerubbabel's return. It describes all of that, and then along comes Ezra the priest, and he really makes the temple happen. And they want to get back into their Yahwistic worship around the temple and so on. And at the end of the book of Ezra, chapter 9, where we read, Ezra is suddenly confronted with something that is for him is quite shocking. So it says, "And the people of Israel, and the priests and the Levites hadn't separated themselves from the people of the lands, the Canaanites, the Hittites, and most importantly here, the Moabites." So this is a problem for Ezra, that the people that he's supposed to be leading, their leaders and their priests, had intermarried with the nations around them. And you remember last time we were thinking in Deuteronomy that had been prohibited back then, and was something that's still to be remembered. It's something that, and in particular, if you go back to Deuteronomy in the context, it was because of the fact that they had religious practices in their worship of their gods, which were seen as abhorrent in Israel, and a corrupting of the religious system. And so, as it goes on, because they had taken of their daughters for themselves and for their sons. So, very specifically, the problem Ezra is encountering, is he sees it, is that his officials and even his priests have intermarried with people that Deuteronomy had told them they shouldn't do, and they should be wary of, and they should stay away from them, for the very reason that, you see, these people often had practices in their religious worship that they would bring in that were at the best kind of superstitious and a little bit occult-like, and at the worst cases it ended up with human sacrifice, so they'd been excluded. So for Ezra this is a massive problem, and if you think about it, here they all are, they're coming back from exile, and they've seen the exile as being taken away into other nations as God's judgment for the fact that religiously they're becoming corrupt and their worship had become tainted. That was part of Ezekiel's message. And so as he thinks about it, and he kind of declares as he's encountered these, "When I heard these matters," he says, I tore my garments and my robes, I pulled out my hair from my head and my beard, and I sat down, I was appalled." And he goes on and grieves, and it goes on towards the end of that chapter 9 and says, "Oh Lord God of Israel, you're righteous, and we've been left with an escaped remnant today, and behold, before you we're here in our guilt." So in other words, it's kind of, you're now restoring us, the temple is getting restored, we've re-put worship back in place, and right from the beginning we've got these things which seem to be going wrong. So it's a big issue for Ezra. So Ezra comes up with a solution. He doesn't hear from the Lord what he should do, he kind of does it according to the righteousness that belongs to the law and to priesthood. And so he rounds them all up, and he identifies 100 families out of about 45,000 plus, so it's not a big percentage, it's less than 0.2% of the families. He identifies around that 100 families that have married like this, and he makes them divorce their wives, send them away. And that's his solution, and that's how the book finishes. And it finishes, the last verse of Ezra says, all those that have married foreign wives, and some of them had wives who had children, they put them away. That's it. Bang. The end. Well, it creates a real circumstance within the nation of Israel at the very time, as I say, when the Bible is reaching its final form as we have it today. About 10 years after Ezra, Nehemiah is back helping organise and restore the walls. And Nehemiah kind of has a little, as he gets towards the end, he has a bit of a kind of review of the history, and he refers back to this time when it had been discovered that the elders and so on had been intermarrying, makes reference to Ezra, and says, and I'm just going to read the words, and the way he puts it in chapter 13, "During this time I wasn't at Jerusalem, and then I came to Jerusalem." So he refers back to something that happened before he was there, but he now notices in his own day, in those days, this is now chapter 13 verse 23-24, "In those days I also saw that the Jews who had married women of Ashdod and Ammon and of Moabite and their children, and couldn't even speak the Jews' language, but according to the language of each of the people." So he's now saying, even in my day, which is another 10 years or so, this is still going on. But he has a little bit more
of a problem. For Ezra, the solution seemed hard and it grieved him, but he knew what to do. It was the law, and so he did it, and he made them kind of divorce their wives. Nehemiah is stuck with a bit more of a problem. It's an ongoing issue, and actually in between Ezra doing what he did and Nehemiah coming, we also have the input of the prophet Malachi. Well, we call him Malachi, but actually Malachi just simply means the messenger. So it's probably not actually his name. It's kind of a title. Actually, Jewish tradition makes Ezra the prophet Malachi, which is interesting because if it is the same person, I don't know if it is or not, but if it is the same person as a prophet, speaking, if you like, out of the freshness of relationship, Malachi contradicts what Ezra did as a priest, as we're going to see. So you get this tension that's going on. And to understand the story of Ruth within this, we're intermarrying, and in particular Moabite women keep coming up. We're intermarrying, and the law says we shouldn't, and yet somehow it's part of our religious and cultural life right the way through now. The marriage has gone on, and so Ezra, as the priest and bringing the letter of the law, has said you've got to divorce. But now Malachi comes along, and in chapter 2, verse 11, he says, "So Judah has profaned the holiness of Yahweh, which he loves, and he has married the daughters of a foreign god." So he's making reference back to this occasion that happened under Ezra. But he goes on as he's kind of describing that. And in verse 14 he now says, "And Yahweh has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth." Now who are those wives of his youth? Well, they are of course these Moabite women, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is the companion and your wife by covenant. So there's a kind of a double-edged thing going on here, because in one sense God is for the nation is the wife of their youth, but actually as we come into this immediate context, the wife of their youth, their first wives, were these Moabite women, and God is now saying, but you have dealt treacherously with them, even though you had married them and they were your companions by covenant. And Malachi goes on, so he says, you need to take heed to your spirit and let no one deal treacherously against the wife of his youth. So it's not just the whole big nation, because that is in view, because the whole nation was unfaithful to God, if you like, and they were in covenant relationship from their youth. But actually in their immediate lives, you don't solve it by doing here in the local what in one sense, in the big prophetic sense, you've done with your religion. And so he says, God says, and so I hate divorce, says Yahweh the God of Israel. So that's the context that Nehemiah is now looking at the same problem as happened just 10 years before, but now in a place where he knows that somehow it's wrong, because there were even children involved in this divorce and this putting out. And you put out a wife in an ancient culture, she has very little other ways of making an income, and their children, you remember in the story of Abraham, when he does put out Hagar, and she goes to sit down to die because she can't see any hope, there's nothing for her, and that situation has kind of percolated up. And so Nehemiah comes to it and he grieves over what's happened. It's kind of like, if I wanted to get to where I'm supposed to be going, I wouldn't be starting from here. That's his kind of approach. This isn't the place I would want to start from, but this is where I am. And at the end of the book of Nehemiah, he concludes and understands that the principles of being separate from those religious systems weren't wrong, but you don't make a right by doing one wrong on top of another wrong. You don't make it right by divorcing a wife and leaving children fatherless. And he's kind of hit this problem. He comes to this little conclusion where he says, at the end of Nehemiah chapter 13, where I'm just trying to find it now. Oh, didn't Solomon, the king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Because he married loads of women from these areas. Didn't Solomon, the king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among all of those nations there was no king like him. In other words, God really blessed him. And yet among the many nations there's no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women did cause him to sin. And so what you see Nehemiah struggling with is it did create a problem, but somehow the grace of God over Solomon still blessed him, and the nation still thrived and prospered. And that's his, if you like, Nehemiah's hope. So I spent rather a long time, we've hardly touched on Ruth at all, but if you kind of sum up what's been going on, if you understand why the story suddenly becomes popular in the post-exilic period when they've come back, it's because this issue of is God going to bless us is a real debate. And there is a kind of a sense prophetically in which the whole of the Old Testament closes with a situation which the law is incapable of resolving. That the law can only make it right by doing something wrong. And in fact, part of the prophetic thrust of the book of Malachi is a refiner who's going to come, who is somehow going to make it acceptable, so that just for a moment there will be a key sacrifice delivered that will make everything kind of right at this point. And there is therefore almost this hope for God to act, for God to take the initiative and do something supernatural, which in the natural is unobtainable via the law. And that's the context of the book of Ruth. Rather a long time to introduce it, but hopefully you get the kind of the political tension. So let's now get back to the actual text of the book, shall we? So Ruth chapter 2 is actually made up of kind of three scenes, two mini scenes and a larger one at the middle. Those three scenes take us to the end of the barley harvest. So we get to the end of Ruth chapter 22, sorry, not the end of the barley harvest, the end of the wheat harvest. Remember at the end of chapter 1 it was the beginning of the barley harvest, and now it's the end of the wheat harvest. So that's actually a period of about 7 weeks. It's the period that gives us Pentecost. This happens, if you like, time-wise, in between the period of resurrection through to the time of Pentecost, over those 7 weeks. And during that period, the beginning, as I say, the first little section we might think of, which is made up of verses 1 to 3, we might think of that section as being Ruth's hope. It's not Naomi's hope, because she had no hope at the end of the first chapter, but she has some hopes, and she goes off to pursue them. They're not big hopes, but she goes after them anyway. And in that context, she meets this man Boaz. And so we'll think of the middle section as being Boaz's kindness, because he does behave very well towards Ruth. And then as we get to the end and she comes back and kind of reports how things are going to Naomi, some hope starts to rise in Naomi. So we finish with Naomi's hope. So those are the kind of the three sections as we think about them. So let's just stop a little bit and think about the structure of that first section, the first 3 verses. So although it's only 3 verses, already as you can start to see this kind of pattern that we started to notice in the first chapter, the way in which things are structured in such a way to make them easy to remember. So in verse 1 of chapter 2 you read about a wealthy man from the clan of Elimelech. So remember Elimelech, which is Naomi's husband, so it's from his clan. There was a wealthy man whose name was Boaz. And you finish this section in verse 3, it says the field of Boaz, so he gets mentioned, who was from the clan of Elimelech. So you can see that reflexive shape. And then in the middle you've got a kind of a pairing between Ruth and Naomi speaking. So in verse 2, chapter 2 verse 2, Ruth said, let me go to the field to glean. And in verse 3, Naomi said, so go to the field and glean. So Ruth says, can I? And Ruth says, so go and do it. Which kind of puts, therefore, right at the middle of it, the key kind of moment to understand from this little introduction is Ruth's statement where she says in verse 2, she says, let me go to the field to glean among the ears of grain after, so she's looking for something, after one in whose sight I might find favour. And so Naomi said to her, go my daughter. So Naomi is speaking in response. So the kind of the middle of this first section, which is why I called it Ruth's hope, is that here they are, they've got back to this strange land. They are basically beggars, and in this context Ruth says to her mother-in-law, well, I'd like to go and do my begging by gleaning. And so gleaning, the way it worked, and it's something that was prescribed in the law of Israel, is that when they're harvesting, the men would go through first and they're cutting down the grain, and as they cut it, then the women come after them and they gather them up quickly and bind them, and they just leave them standing and bind and stand, and they move through the field that way. But of course, when you're doing that at speed, you're moving fast, there are always going to be loose threads of grain that get left on the floor. And so the law said you're not allowed to go back and kind of pick those bits up, leave those, and those are to feed those that need it. The poor is their way of kind of, and it became part of the bigger culture. Remember in Jesus' day, therefore, as they're passing through the wheat fields, they're picking up grains and rubbing them between their hands, and they get accused of milling on a Sabbath as a result, and as they kind of feed themselves in those ways. That it was just part, if you like, of the welfare of the nation that those things should be allowed. And so Ruth has said, I'd like to go and glean. That's a fair thing to do, but she's actually given us a hope. Why? Because she's hoping that in amongst all those young men who are doing the work, there's one there who might notice her and might take favour on them, and she might improve her situation. And she needs Ruth's permission, she needs Naomi's permission in one sense, because she used to be married to her son, and Naomi gives it to her and says, go away my daughter, go and do that. So she's deliberately gone to pursue her career, which is a very poor person, but in a context where there will be young eligible men, and she might have some hope in that situation. So then we move into the next section where we start to encounter the workers of Boaz. So this section runs all the way through to the end of verse 17. And again, you still see this kind of reflexive structure, but what we're going to start noticing is that it starts to become a little bit looser. That's not unusual biblically. Is when we start a story, this kind of more formal structure is a way of making sure we get all of the key component parts in place. And as we've got those component parts in place, we can start to then become a little bit more expansive and tell the story within that context. So as we get into the heart of chapter 2, it becomes a little bit more free-flowing, but you can still see some of this balancing going on. So in verse 4, for instance, we meet Boaz, who comes and meets and greets his workers, whereas at the end of the chapter it's a different person now, but it's the contrast between the two. We meet Ruth, who goes and gleans and beats barley. But so we kind of start and finish with the two key characters, and in the middle the two meet. So in verses 5 to 7, Boaz comes and greets his workers and talks to them, and whereas in verse 15 to 16, Boaz and his workers talk again, but this time it's a different conversation. And in the middle there are two kind of conversational elements where now Boaz has met Ruth and he has a conversation with Ruth, and then he invites Ruth to come and eat with him. So those two sections there. So you can see that structure. You say, well, it may not be quite as tight as the others, but that's exactly the point I'm making. As we get more now into the narrative side of the story, these little structural elements play a less of a role. They're there importantly to kind of help the storyteller make sure everything's in place and the listeners have heard all the right moments, and now we start to get to the real meat of the story. So let's start reading the text and see exactly what happened. So verse 4, so behold a man, I should have said actually when we were looking at the first section, the writer of the story has introduced Boaz in verse 1. Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, who was of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, again, it's you find this as a kind of a common format within biblical storytelling, is the narrator has introduced the character, but that doesn't mean Naomi is thinking about this character. And the part of the reason the narrator has introduced him is to create the sense of structure that we have by naming him again at the end. So he introduces the concept of a man that Naomi is not thinking about at all, and highlights to us that he's part of the same clan. Just want to make a quick note of that clan, because he's part of the Ephrathite clan. When we get to chapter 4, we're going to think a little bit more specifically about the timing of this story within the context of the book of Judges. We have to see that it's certainly a period where the Ephrathites are a complete clan, and they would have been a mini clan from the moment they got into the promised land, but it's probably a larger clan in the sense that it's not immediately in Naomi's mind. She knows who he is, but there's quite a few folks who are part of that clan. There's no specific reason why she would have instantly thought of Boaz. So he introduces him, but Naomi knows nothing about him. Now we meet him properly. Verse 4, now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, may the Lord bless you, which is a lovely way of establishing that Boaz is a righteous man, that he's blessing his workers, and his workers, because they like their boss, presumably turn back and say, may the Lord bless you too. So there's that kind of nice little greeting, and as he comes in, he sees his workers working, and he sees the women collecting the grain together after the men have reaped it. He obviously notices someone he doesn't recognise. And so Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, and whose young woman is this? Pointing towards Ruth. And the servant in charge of the reapers answered and said, oh, she's the young Moabite woman, the one who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. So obviously the story has gone out and people are aware of it. And not only that, but we understand therefore by implication that Ruth has gone and talked to them and has asked permission and said, is it okay? And they've allowed her to work with them. They know that they're allowed to leave gleanings, and so she's working in those ways. She returned with Naomi from the land of Moab, and where are we? And he goes on to explain, and she said to us, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. You can notice that specifically it's after the reapers rather than the collectors, because the reapers are the guys. So she's in there quite in the close mix. So as the women are kind of gathering, she's right up there in amongst it, collecting as they go, perhaps hoping, as I said, to see one of those young men and to find favour, as she expressed her desire at the beginning of this chapter. And he went on and said, and she's even been sitting in the house for a little while. So obviously somehow or other she'd got in quite well with the workers. They seemed to like her and they let her sit with them, and she's been collecting up close rather than kind of miles and miles further back. Actually, I missed because we didn't read it. In verse 3, it talks about how she came, when she's going through this, to the portion of the field that belonged to Boaz, although she doesn't know who he is. So she's in that kind of context. So then Boaz goes and approaches Ruth, and Boaz says to Ruth, now listen carefully, my daughter, which is just saying, what I'm saying to you is important. Don't go and glean in another field. Furthermore, and don't go from this one, but stay here with my maids. So he puts the emphasis on the young women that she is, of course, in the midst of, and let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. And indeed I've commanded my servants, which is important to hear this, because of course it is a very natural situation. I've commanded my servants, and they're not to touch you, they're not to do anything to you, for all kinds of reasons, that they might interfere with her, but he's told them not to. So he's had that layer of protection. And he said, and when you're thirsty, go to the water jars and drink what the servants draw. In other words, don't draw it yourself. You just think of yourself as part of the mix, part of the work crew here. Even though the work you're doing is for yourself, you're allowed to partake of all the benefits, and you can draw water. They know that you're not to be interfered with, even if you're drinking water that they've drawn. And so she falls on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favour in your sight, that you should take notice of me, because I am a foreigner? And Boaz answered and said to her, all that you've done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and you came to a people that you didn't previously know. So may the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. And it's that lovely little phrase, that kind of idea of coming under the wings, something that Jesus actually picks up in Matthew 23, how I would love to gather you under my wings. It's a protective line. And as we're going to see when we get to chapter 4, it actually becomes a part of the, if you like, romantic invitation that Ruth makes towards Boaz. But for the time being, I just want to kind of flag it. So under whose wings, and those wings being the wings of God in this kind of context that Boaz puts to her. And then she said, so I found favour in your sight, my lord, and you have comforted me. Indeed, you have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of yours. And then Boaz takes it further. And at mealtime, Boaz said, well, why don't you come up here and eat the bread? So it's not just the grain. And do you remember, as I said, when Jesus' disciples are walking through, they take the grain and they rub it in their hands, and that you can kind of mill it just in fingers, and therefore you can eat the grain. Of course, it's a bit dry, but it has protein in it. But here he said, no, come up and eat our bread, processed, fully processed. And not only that, but when you take a hunk of bread, which of course will be a bit dry on a hot day, dip it in the vinegar, make it socky but tasty and flavoursome, and with extra kind of minerals and vitamins and whatever the manky old wine that's turned to vinegar tastes like. So it may not seem like a great meal to us, but we go to posh restaurants and sometimes and dip our bread in the balsamic vinegar, so it still happens today. So he invites her up, and they eat together, and And so then she rose to glean, and Boaz commanded his servant, saying, now when she gleans among the sheaves, don't insult her, and also purposely leave more than you normally would. So if you imagine normally the way gleaning is, we're kind of quickly running through, we're pulling together and binding up the sheaves, and there's a few left over. What he's now saying is you're pulling it and binding them together, also deliberately chuck a few out so that there's some more for her. And something's obviously going on in Boaz. And Boaz, remember, is described as a wealthy man. And as a wealthy man in a normal kind of patriarchal sort of society, it normally means he's a slightly older man. So he's established. It's of note when a young man is wealthy. As you remember in the Gospels, the man who comes to him is rich, who's a young ruler. It probably means his parents have died while he was still quite young, and so he's inherited it quickly. But wealth normally stuck with the kind of the main patriarch until his death. So the fact that Boaz is a wealthy man implies he's a little bit older, whereas we know that Ruth is a young girl. And straight away we kind of get this kind of classic sort of love story situation. It's very kind of Jane Austen. I always think of Sense and Sensibility here. It's the kind of older protective man who notices a young girl, and there's this kind of strangely weird but appropriate kind of emotional connection that starts, as it happens in Sense and Sensibility, if you know the story, between Colonel Brandon and young Marianne, who's only 17. And Marianne doesn't kind of get it from her point of view, because she's a young girl with all her usual kind of aspirations for her life and so on, and he doesn't want to overstep the mark, but he kind of feels an affection to her, particularly her vulnerability, and kind of steps in this protective way. And we see all of that kind of dynamic going on with Boaz. He's turned up, he's noticed her, he's taken care of her, he's impressed by what he's heard about her. Those things might make a note and so on, but they all seem in one sense a little bit inappropriate because of his age and her age, and that's part of the story of, if you know that story in Jane Austen, part of the tension of the thing. And so it's not immediately kind of revealed what's going on, perhaps because he's struggling in himself with what he's feeling and whether it feels appropriate or not. But he's made sure that she's well provisioned for, and of course he can emotionally say to himself, tell himself the story, well, of course I'm doing it for the sake of her mother or her mother-in-law, and I am kind of related. And so as we're kind of moving on through nearly at the end of this little section, so they purposely pull out the green. So she gleaned in the field until the evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And that's the point where this kind of section finishes. Now we kind of start to move on to the last bit, where she returns and brings the story to Naomi, who has a better idea of what's going on, as we shall see. So the last section of this chapter, I think I referred to it as being now Naomi's hope, because as Ruth comes back with this full ephah of barley, I should have checked out exactly what that is in modern weights, but it's a large amount. I think it's the idea, far more than she would expect to bring back from a simple day's gleaning. So Ruth 2, 18 to 23 is that final section. So verse 18 says, she and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and that balances with verse 23, she gleaned to the end and lived with her mother-in-law. So we got that same kind of contrast, start and finish the whole thing. And then there's a kind of this nested kind of dull situation where Naomi says, where have you been and who noticed you? And then that contrast, that's verse 19, that contrasts with verse 22 with Naomi saying, so go out with the young women. It's kind of those commands, if you like, and directions from Naomi. And then in the middle you have some kind of comments from Ruth. So Ruth says, well, his name was Boaz. And Ruth's kind of response is, and actually I'm going to stick with his young men, if you look at it in verse 21. So Ruth says his name is Boaz, and yes, and he said to me, so I could stay close to the young men, which is why Naomi says, no, you go and stick with the young women. We'll come to that in a bit. And Naomi kind of now in the middle of it, and this is why it's kind of quite key, it's kind of middle little section, she says, Yahweh be blessed, because that man's a close relative. It's this expression of hope. Do you remember I said the first section we'll call it Ruth's hope, because the middle section was Ruth saying, I'll go out gleaning after someone who might be favourable to me, someone that might find favour, there might be the possibility of a relationship. And whereas this section kind of centres itself on that Yahweh be blessed, because that man is a close relative. And she sees something that I don't think Ruth does. does, as we kind of we may have spotted it already as I've gone through this. So let's just read the passage. So starting in verse 18, and so she takes up her barley, and she went to the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also took out and gave Naomi what was left after she'd been satisfied. So she'd eaten plenty during the day, so most of what she brought back wasn't even needing to be shared. It goes straight to her mother-in-law. And so her mother-in-law said to her, "Where on earth did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you," because she realises straight away she's obviously had special favour, "be blessed." And so she said to her mother-in-law, she told her mother-in-law in whom she had worked, and she said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi gives her a little explanation. Naomi said to her daughter, may he be blessed of the Lord, or blessed of Yahweh, who has not withdrawn his kindness from the living and the dead. And again Naomi said, "This man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives." And that closest relative in English is kind of driving at the Hebrew word, which has the implication he is a relative who has a requirement to act on our behalf. And so Naomi has turned up back at Bethlehem, and she's come with all her despair. She's never even really hit it, even perhaps you know how when things go wrong you just tend to assume nothing will go right, and she's been in that mental place. And so although there is somebody who has a requirement or a responsibility, let's say they have a responsibility under the law system to take care of relatives who are very close to them who fall into bad situations, she's just never expected that any of them will. And suddenly she realizes that inadvertently, but probably by a bit of divine help and inspiration, her daughter-in-law Ruth has stumbled on the fields that belong to this man Boaz. And not only that, she's met him and he has shown her favour straight away. And so all of these things combine together, and Naomi suddenly is excited by the prospect that maybe God is going to do something. And instantly you kind of get the implication in the text that Naomi sees a possibility which at the moment Ruth hasn't spotted, because as we've already kind of touched on it when we just thought about the structure of this section, let me just find the he said to me, "You should harvest and stay close to my servants until they have finished all of the harvest." And now that's Ruth speaking. So she said, Naomi says he's a close relative, and then Ruth the Moabite said, moreover he said, "You should stay close to my servants until we finish the harvest." In other words, you can keep doing this right the way through the harvest time. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It's good, my daughter, that you go out with his maids." So Ruth has said servants, which includes both men and women. Naomi said it's good that you go out with his young women. And she then kind of tries to draw it home, because unless others fall upon you in another field. In other words, the guys can't always be trusted. But probably in Naomi's mind, if we're kind of reading between the lines a little bit, she also understands to take your eyes off those young men for a second, please, because there might be another possibility here. But she doesn't want to almost express it. The hope is too much. So Ruth's view is, I'm going out with the servants, and probably there's some young men there because that's what she's gone out looking for. Naomi realises, well, he might be a bit older, but he has a responsibility, and these things do happen. And so it says, and so she stayed close to the maid, that's Ruth now, she stayed close to the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and then she lived with her mother-in-law. So for that whole of that period, she's regularly going out with the same group and the same crowd, and we kind of left, there's a longish period, it's taking place over the whole summer, which again gives you that kind of sense of tension. It's not some sort of rushed thing, but actually there is something beginning to develop, as we're going to start to unpack as we get into chapters 3 and 4. We're going to see that, and we don't know all of the interactions and the things that are reported back that Ruth has told Naomi as she comes, but Naomi has been watching the situation, as we're going to see in chapter 3. She realises it's time for now to be a little bit more explicit with Ruth, and to encourage Ruth to make an explicit kind of, if you like, invitation. We're going to find out about that next week as the story kind of comes to that kind of key moment of will he or won't he, and does she really get it, and is she going to do as what is going to be the best thing for her in the end. So we're moving towards that climax. It'll be great to unpack it with you next time, but for today I think we'll leave it there. But I just perhaps finishing this kind of this story story, again, to go back to that thing of the context that we're telling this in, this kind of key love story, which is happening at a time where, if you like, the inadequacies of a simple legal system to please God are beginning to be put into pressure and tension. And as they look back in their own history, they see their key moments. We've already had Nehemiah mentioning Solomon, that somehow the grace of God is able to get in, as it did in the story of David. So back in Deuteronomy, this Moabite lady who comes and breaks into the situation of their national history through a relationship with a slightly older man, a slightly more mature man, maybe not really old, but a bit more at the kind of peak of his career, and yet there's an affection that comes about between them that gives birth to a child. And of course that child becomes David, and the sum of their best moments in their history as they look back on it come out of a time that was hardly ideal from a religious point of view. They never, at this stage, they're being very cautious. They're not wanting to throw away the religious aspects because they want to be devoted to God, but they are beginning to see the tensions of why sometimes what God does and is the right thing breaks outside of those natural boundaries. In that sense, it's kind of beautifully setting up the Messianic age. And to finish with Malachi, who'd first spoken into this problem from a prophetic point of view, that a righteous purifier would come to make the path straight, but there would then be this perfect sacrifice that somehow would bring the full principles of all of the law would come to its completion. And that, of course, is Jesus, and we see this story progressing towards that moment. So anyway, we'll see you next time.